In the waning years of the 19th century, in a hushed pocket of Indiana farmland, two sisters were found living in complete silence within the grounds of a charitable institution for children. What began as a case of supposed psychological trauma quietly unraveled into something far more troubling: an institutional cover-up, unexplained disappearances, and documents that would vanish from state archives for over 6 decades. The Mute Sisters of Vesper County would go on to become a whispered legend, but buried beneath the folk horror lies a deeply unsettling reality, one that implicates an entire system designed to suppress the most vulnerable and protect the powerful. Despite multiple investigations between 1893 and 1947, no clear explanation was ever given for how Margaret and Eliza Winthorpe lost their voices, or why their records abruptly ended. Today we attempt to reconstruct the suppressed story of what really happened inside the Vesper County Home for Infirm Children. The Vesper County Home for Infirm Children was founded in 1878 as part of Indiana's rapidly expanding network of charitable social services. Nestled between the cornfields and timber ridges near the town of Connersburg, the facility was originally promoted as a progressive response to the state's rising population of so-called pauper youth, orphans, developmentally disabled children, and those considered morally unfit by late Victorian standards. By the early 1890s, the institution had garnered a reputation that was equal parts revered and feared. Its director, Reverend Amos H. Ellaby, a devout Presbyterian and former medical orderly during the Civil War, had a reputation for sternness cloaked in piety. He gave long sermons on discipline, hygiene, and God's will, and he insisted that the home was no place for sentimentality. Under his leadership, the home received state commendations for efficient operation and low recidivism, language that, in retrospect, seems chillingly bureaucratic. Official reports from the Indiana Board of State Charities described the Vesper home as clean, well-staffed, and morally upright. These evaluations, however, were almost always conducted after notification of inspection dates. Nurses and orderlies were coached on what to say. The children were dressed in freshly laundered uniforms, given extra rations of bread and milk, and instructed to smile during the commissioner's visits. It was during this carefully cultivated period of reputation management that the Winthorpe sisters arrived in the spring of 1893. Margaret was 9 years old. Eliza was 7. Both were thin, pale, and reportedly mute upon arrival. Their mother, Eleanor Winthorpe, had died the previous winter from what the coroner termed pneumonia, complicated by nervous exhaustion. No father was listed on any surviving document. A neighbor in their rural township, a Mrs. Viola Trenholm, had made the initial referral to the county orphan board, stating that the girls had been without guardianship for weeks and had a quiet about them that is not right. The intake files for Margaret and Eliza contain only the barest details: names, ages, hair color, blonde, and the word nonverbal scribbled next to both. The line for medical assessment is ominously blank. No notations exist on psychological condition, speech therapy referrals, or attempts to determine the cause of their muteness. What is unusual and telling is that while most children at the Vesper home were assigned a guardian advocate, usually a local volunteer or church member, the Winthorpe sisters were not. No explanation was given. Instead, they were placed directly under the care of matron Josephine Harrow, a tall, wiry woman who had served as the institution's de facto head nurse for over a decade. According to later depositions collected in the suppressed 1947 review of the facility, Harrow believed silence was a form of moral decay, the result of stubbornness and impure thoughts. It is not clear whether she ever attempted to communicate with the girls in writing or sign language. What is clear, however, is that within 2 weeks of their arrival, the sisters were removed from the general dormitories and relocated to what staff referred to as the North Wing. The North Wing was an unused annex originally built to serve as an isolation ward during the scarlet fever outbreak of 1885. By 1893, it was used sparingly, and only for children deemed either dangerously ill or behaviorally unmanageable. Its windows were barred, its hallways unlit after dark, and no children housed there were allowed to participate in communal dining or outdoor recreation. According to a janitor named Levi Dunst, who worked the grounds between 1891 and 1902, "Them girls never came out. I mean never. We was told not to speak of it." Harrow said they needed moral quarantine, whatever that means. Dunst's statement, recorded decades later in a quietly conducted oral history interview, remains one of the only eyewitness accounts of the sisters' time in the home. For months, the institution maintained that the Winthorpe sisters were receiving special care. Reverend Ellaby continued to report to the Board of State Charities that the home had no serious medical cases and that all children were receiving appropriate physical and spiritual instruction. Yet internally, rumors spread among staff about nighttime crying, unexplainable bruises, and a foul odor emanating from the north wing, which some claimed was due to a malfunctioning furnace. No repairs were ever documented. In November of 1893, Dr. Linus Copeland, the part-time physician contracted by the home, submitted an unsigned letter to the State Medical Board alleging neglect and willful mistreatment of nonverbal patients. While the letter was never acted upon, a draft was later discovered among Dr. Copeland's personal papers following his death in 1931. In it, he describes an incident in which Margaret Winthorpe flinched violently at his approach and refused to make eye contact, as though she had been conditioned to fear even the suggestion of human proximity. Copeland wrote, "Their silence is not natural. It has the quality of something enforced, through repetition or coercion. It is my belief that these children were not born this way." Despite the mounting concerns, the Board of State Charities continued to fund the Vesper home without interruption. Reverend Ellaby was even invited to speak at the 1894 State Conference on Moral Reclamation of the Orphan Class. There is no mention of the Winthorpe sisters in his address. That same year, a young social reformer named Claire Follis made her first and only visit to the home. Follis had been traveling the state conducting independent assessments of children's institutions, part of a private initiative funded by the Women's Temperance and Welfare Society. In her personal journals, later archived at Indiana University, she wrote the following after her Vesper visit. "I was allowed only limited access. Most of the children seemed healthy if subdued. When I asked to see the north wing, I was told it was under fumigation. I did glimpse a girl through a panelled glass door. She stood still as stone, her eyes hollow. A second child lay on a cot, unmoving. Neither spoke. The matron said they were beyond help. I have never felt so helpless." 3 months later, both Margaret and Eliza vanished from the Vesper home's official roster. No discharge papers were filed, no adoption notices, no death certificates. Just a redacted line in the March 1894 quarterly report that reads, "Disposition, reassignment, re-evaluation." The phrase appears nowhere else in the state's archival record of children's homes. It was as though the sisters had been administratively erased. Despite this, former staff recalled hearing the girls at night well into the late summer of 1894. A junior nurse, Agnes Wirth, would later say, "They didn't scream, it was worse. It was like they were humming inside themselves, like the sound you make when you're trying to keep from falling apart." By 1895, the north wing was officially shuttered, the doorways were boarded up, and the Reverend Amos H. Ellaby resigned his position for health reasons. He died 3 years later in Chicago, leaving behind no known personal letters or diaries. In the decades that followed, the Winthorpe case was mentioned only once in state proceedings, during a closed-door inquiry into the management practices of Indiana's charitable institutions. The inquiry was inconclusive. Records from that session remain sealed to this day. What remains are whispers, fragments, and a silence that endured far beyond the lives of the mute sisters of Vesper County. In the years immediately following the unexplained disappearance of Margaret and Eliza Winthorpe from the Vesper County Home for Infirm Children, the silence surrounding their case hardened into something more troubling: institutional forgetfulness. This was not the benign oversight of overburdened clerks or outdated filing systems. It was deliberate, a methodical effort to erase not only the girls themselves, but also any record of concern, inquiry, or objection. And yet, across a span of more than 5 decades, signs continued to surface. They were scattered, often subtle, occasionally overt, but in every instance they were ignored. The first documented attempt to revisit the case came in 1902, when Levi Dunst, the janitor who had spoken of the sisters' confinement, sent a handwritten letter to the newly established Indiana Bureau of Child Protection. In it, he claimed that he had personally seen the younger girl carried from the North Wing one night in April of 1894 by 2 men in county uniforms. He did not identify the men, but insisted they were not doctors, nor any staff I ever knew. The Bureau never responded. The letter was found in 1978, folded into the back cover of an outdated property ledger from the same year. Around the same time Dunst was writing, the North Wing was quietly demolished during a campus expansion. While other renovations at the Vesper home were logged in detail, including costs, contractor names, and photographs, the demolition of the North Wing appeared in no official blueprints. What records did survive refer to it euphemistically as a site preparation clearance. By 1906, the Vesper home had rebranded itself as the Connersburg Institute for Youth Development, shifting its language to reflect the growing progressive era emphasis on rehabilitation over discipline. Reverend Ellaby's successor, Director Harold Stillman, was a soft-spoken reformer who favored calisthenics, temperance lectures, and craft-based training. But Stillman, like Ellaby, made no mention of the Winthorpe girls in any surviving correspondence. When interviewed decades later by a young public health researcher named Ruth Malden, Stillman reportedly claimed, "We never housed mute girls here. You must be thinking of some other place." Yet traces of the sisters continued to emerge, clues that, if taken seriously, could have reignited investigation. In 1911, a local schoolteacher named Bernice Goff led a literacy workshop at the Institute and reported to the State Teachers Association that she encountered a file cabinet in the infirmary wing labeled W that contained only 2 files, Margaret and Eliza Winthorpe. According to her brief note, both folders contained blank-lined pages, each one with a different inkblot pressed into the center. Goff thought the pages were part of some early attempt at projective testing, but no one followed up. Her observation appeared as a single sentence in a 37-page report, buried between notations about paper supplies and blackboard chalk orders. A far more disturbing report came 5 years later, in 1916, when Dr. Isaiah McCready, then a newly certified physician assigned to rotate between Indiana's charitable institutions, filed an anonymous complaint to the Indianapolis Department of Mental Hygiene. The complaint, later attributed to McCready through handwriting comparison, described what he believed to be an undocumented patient or test subject kept in a sub-level room of the Institute. He wrote, "I was taken under the guidance of Matron Harrow, still in service at the time, to examine a private ward near the old boiler room. The child, or perhaps adult of stunted growth, had hair cropped unevenly and bore signs of long-term institutionalization. She made no sound, only rocked slowly in a cot. Harrow called her one of the ghosts. I was not permitted to ask questions. The file I was handed bore the name Winthorpe, but no first name. I was told she was not to be moved, touched, or mentioned again. Dr. McCready's complaint was stamped, "Reviewed, no action recommended." A decade later, Matron Josephine Harrow retired with honors, praised for her 38 years of continuous service to the moral guidance of youth. There was another detail, however, that did not appear in official commendations. In 1923, Harrow moved into a rooming house in southern Indianapolis, where she died a recluse 12 years later. According to landlady Edith Cullen, Harrow kept a locked chest at the foot of her bed, which she forbade anyone from touching. After her death, Cullen claimed she opened it out of curiosity and found only 2 items, a tiny velvet pouch containing a child's tooth and a cracked slate tablet with the words, "I saw you," scratched over and over in increasingly uneven script. The chest was discarded. As decades passed, the original staff of the Vesper home died off or dispersed. By the 1940s, the institution was staffed largely by young professionals unfamiliar with its early history. But the memory of the Mute sisters never entirely disappeared, especially among those who had grown up in Connersburg. One such person was Myron Spess, a former resident of the institute who later became a county surveyor. In a 1943 interview with the Indiana WPA Folklore Project, Spess recalled, "They used to scare us kids with stories about the girls that never spoke, said they lived in the walls. I remember once in winter, I found an old nameplate near the chapel ruins. It said Eliza W. It was rusted and sharp as a knife. I hid it under my mattress till they made us all switch rooms." The folklore surrounding the sisters grew more spectral over time, encouraged by isolation, guilt, and the unwillingness of officials to clarify the truth. But one effort, briefly and quietly undertaken, came close to confronting the institution's past directly. In 1947, after a new wave of scrutiny on charitable homes prompted by a national investigation into juvenile care standards, a limited internal review was launched into the early records of the Connersburg Institute. The review, known officially as the Supplemental Archival Audit, was conducted by two junior archivists, Glenna Hirsch and Paul Talcott, under the direction of the Indiana State Office of Administrative Oversight. Their findings, though never publicly released, would resurface decades later in microfilm form, misfiled under an unrelated grant program and rediscovered in 1982. The audit revealed what Hirsch called a systematic pattern of record falsification, patient reassignment euphemisms, and unexplained disappearances, particularly among nonverbal or developmentally disabled children between 1889 and 1905. Included in their notes were specific references to the Winthorpe sisters. Hirsch wrote, "No death, adoption, or transfer records can be found for either girl." Yet staff logs as late as October 1894 reference Girls W, low response, high maintenance. Cross-checking these against meal rosters reveals that 2 additional portions were regularly prepared and delivered to the North Wing well past the point of their alleged departure. Talcott's addendum went further. These were not bureaucratic errors. This was concealment. Someone, likely more than one person, was committed to obscuring the truth about these girls' fate. Despite these damning conclusions, the audit's release was blocked. The state's legal counsel cited insufficient cause for retroactive disciplinary measures. Both Hirsch and Talcott resigned shortly thereafter. Their departure letters, preserved only in a handwritten form, mention pressure from above and a culture of omerta. And then, silence again. Until 1978, when a graduate student in psychology, Annette Dorr, stumbled upon Levi Dunst's letter while researching early residential care models. Her thesis advisor encouraged her not to include it in her work, warning that the institute, by then renamed and privatized, was not a useful target for academic criticism. Dorr ignored him. She submitted her thesis with a dedicated chapter on the Winthorpe case. The chapter was redacted by her review board before publication. Dorr was not offered a faculty position. Her career in academia ended there. The signs had been there all along. But no matter how many files surfaced, how many whispered recollections were recorded, or how many times someone tried to breach the institutional silence, the same outcome followed: dismissal, redirection, or disappearance of the evidence itself. By the close of the 20th century, the fate of Margaret and Eliza Winthorpe remained unknown. And the silence they embodied, once dismissed as a symptom of trauma, now appeared to be the result of something far more calculated, a system designed to suppress not only their voices, but their very existence. Their names were never engraved on any memorial, their case never reached court, and in Connersburg, Indiana, no plaque, marker, or stone bears witness to the 2 sisters who, even in silence, tried to tell the world something was terribly wrong. In 1984, amid an era of increased scrutiny into institutional abuse across the United States, a local historian named Edwin J. Lott initiated a quiet but consequential investigation into the early years of the Connersburg Institute, then operating as the private Vespa Children's Rehabilitation Campus. Lot, a soft-spoken former librarian turned amateur archivist, had grown up in Connersburg and remembered the hushed tales of the mute sisters that older residents spoke of only after dusk. His project began innocuously, as a personal effort to compile a centennial history of the institution. What he unearthed would crack open the long-buried trauma of Vespa County. Lot's work started with property records. He obtained blueprints, land transfers, and maintenance logs for the Vespa home and its surrounding structures, dating back to 1877. In a yellowed folder misfiled among zoning requests, he found an original floor plan of the now demolished north wing. It detailed not just sleeping quarters and infirmary beds, but also something not present in any official photographs or inspection documents, a sub-basement chamber with reinforced doors and no windows, marked simply as Annex R. The designation was unusual. Indiana's building codes for institutions at the time did not permit basement-level habitation for minors, and no mention of Annex R appeared in later records. Lot cross-referenced the blueprint with aerial photos from 1921 and discovered the footprint of the annex was visible in an early spring shot, only to vanish in a follow-up from the fall of the same year. What had stood beneath the earth had been buried, quite literally. Lot submitted a request to dig on the site, citing academic interest. The property owners denied him. Undeterred, he reached out to a local contractor who had performed sewer work in the area during the 1960s. The man, Harold Metzger, remembered something odd. During trenching for new water lines, his team had broken through a cavity beneath the old Vespa home foundation, like a tunnel or chamber, he described it. We weren't allowed to keep looking. Management told us to seal it up and keep quiet. Lot documented Metzger's account in his notes, which he compiled into a private manuscript titled The Silent Foundation, a preliminary report on the lost histories of Vespa County Home. He never published it. In April 1985, 3 weeks after sending a draft to the Indiana Historical Review Board, Lot's home was burglarized. The only items missing were his research files. His manuscript survived only because he had mailed a copy to a former colleague in Fort Wayne. That colleague, Martha Riegel, would later describe what she read as the most careful, disturbing piece of local history I've ever seen. She attempted to contact the new administrators of the Vespa campus for comment. Her calls were never returned, but Lot had started something that couldn't be undone. In 1991, a statewide archival reconciliation project intended to digitize and preserve early 20th century institutional records accidentally revealed a misplaced box of files labeled Contingency Reports, Non-Admitted Patients. Most had been flagged for shredding in the late 1950s. One folder bearing the faded label W.N. Reprimand, Matron J.H., 1894, contained 2 typed pages and a series of photos, severely water-damaged but partially legible. The pages described an unauthorized disciplinary protocol involving 2 subjects identified only as M.W. and E.W., presumed to be Margaret and Eliza Winthorpe. The document referenced sensory restriction, restricted alimentation, and long-term silence immersion. No medical authorization was cited. The report concluded that while the methods exceeded state-sanctioned procedures, they were understandable in light of the behavioral severity presented. The photographs were worse. One showed a metal-framed bed enclosed on 3 sides by what appeared to be soundproof panels. Another showed a slate wall with scratch marks, a tally system, or repeated initials, it was unclear. A third, barely visible, captured what looked like a child's hand reaching from beneath a grated opening in the floor. The origin of the photos remains unverified. But an internal memo paperclipped to the report offered chilling context. For legal and reputational reasons, materials pertaining to WN should be permanently archived under discretion protocols. Staff rotation and facility upgrades should mitigate future risks of recurrence. This was not failure, it was design. In 1993, Martha Riegel attempted to publish excerpts of Lot's work and her own findings in a regional history journal. The editorial board rejected her submission, calling it unsubstantiated conspiracy. She responded by organizing a private symposium at the Connersburg Public Library, inviting surviving former residents, former employees, and academic observers. The turnout was modest. Most who had first-hand knowledge had either died or refused to speak, but one man came forward. Arthur Betts, aged 82, had served as a maintenance apprentice at the Vesper home between 1930 and 1934. He had been forbidden to enter the old sub-basement level, but remembered something unsettling. There was a hatch in the laundry room, locked from the outside. We were told never to open it. One night, I heard humming from down there. Soft, low, like lullabies without words. I told the night watchman. He said, "Don't listen, they're not your concern." Betts's account was recorded, transcribed, and later lost when the local archive's cassette storage unit experienced a fire in 1995. The cause was listed as faulty wiring. By the late 1990s, the grounds of the former Vesper home had been redeveloped into a suburban housing complex. Most of the original structure was gone. The developers offered no commemorative marker, no acknowledgement of what had been. But during excavation for the northern cul-de-sac, construction crews unearthed irregular stonework beneath the soil, brick footings and rusted pipe fragments, oddly configured, not matching any modern plumbing schematics. A small cluster of bones was found nearby. Animal, they claimed. The discovery was quietly turned over to the county coroner. No report was issued. The horror of the Winthorpe case is not in its folklore, or even in the silence that shrouded it. The horror lies in its repeatability, in how easily an institution can transform human children into administrable liabilities, and how effortlessly silence can be engineered, sustained, and protected under the banner of care. It was not the girl's muteness that defied science, it was the system that orchestrated and maintained it. And it is not the mystery that is sinister, it is the certainty that others saw, knew, and chose to look away. The Connersburg Institute is gone, its records fractured, its survivors scattered or silenced. But the question remains, how many others were there, whose names did not survive even in whispers? And if the systems that made them disappear still exist, just renamed, rebuilt, or rebranded, who is watching now? By the early 2000s, the history of the Winthorpe sisters had all but vanished from public discourse. The housing development that stood atop the former grounds of the Vesper County home was complete. Cul-de-sacs, mailboxes, and landscaped front yards, neatly erasing a century of institutional trauma. No public signage marked the area's prior use. New residents moved into homes unaware that their property lines bordered what had once been the North Wing. But for those who remembered, or had tried to expose, the story of Margaret and Eliza, forgetting was never an option. In 2006, a second attempt to formally investigate the case was launched, not by journalists or state officials, but by a graduate class in archival anthropology at Purdue University. Led by Dr. Helena Moore, the class focused on recovered silences in American institutional history. Moore had read Martha Regal's unpublished articles and obtained, through back channels, a partial photocopy of Edwin J. Lott's suppressed manuscript. Her students began compiling every known reference to the Winthorpe sisters, building what would become the first centralized index of the case. What they found was not just a case of administrative oversight or tragic error. It was a clear pattern of deliberate suppression spanning generations, preserved across bureaucracies by euphemism, obstruction, and sheer inertia. Through open records requests and private interviews, the class unearthed two new leads. First, a retired social worker named Carol Fenwick came forward with an envelope marked WN 1958. Fenwick had worked briefly at the renamed Connersburg Youth Facility before its final privatization. She recalled being told by her supervisor to stay out of the lower archive, a phrase that at first meant nothing. But while helping clean out a file storage room prior to a renovation, she discovered a ledger detailing extended monitoring of two non-verbal wards under Matron Harrow's tenure. Their names were obscured with ink, but their intake dates matched those of Margaret and Eliza. Fenwick kept a photocopy. She said it felt wrong to destroy it. The second discovery was more abstract, but equally damning. While examining microfilmed Board of State Charities reports from the 1890s, a student named Nathan Yee noticed a recurring asterisk in the disposition column, one that appeared only next to the names of certain children, including the Winthorpes. No key explained the asterisk's meaning, but further review showed a correlation. Each marked child had vanished from records within 1 year of admission, with no follow-up documentation of adoption, transfer, or death. It wasn't a symbol. It was a warning, a signal used internally to designate children who would be removed from standard oversight procedures, quietly, efficiently, and permanently. Armed with these findings, Moore's class submitted a report to the Indiana Historical Commission requesting a formal investigation into archival manipulation by the former Vesper County home. The request was denied. The denial letter cited lack of living witnesses, limited physical evidence, and absence of compelling contemporary relevance. But the relevance was never in doubt. What happened to Margaret and Eliza was not unique. Their silence, and the system that maintained it, echoes through countless other cases across the U.S., cases of forgotten children, manipulated records, and institutional indifference masquerading as benevolence. By 2012, the class's work was archived at Purdue, sealed for ethical review. Public interest in the case rose briefly following a local news segment on Indiana's forgotten institutions, but no major outlet followed up. The town of Connersburg declined to comment. Most of the remaining residents who had grown up hearing rumors of the Sisters in the Walls were gone, moved to retirement homes, or passed on. The only permanent trace of the Winthorpe sisters now exists as metadata, digital fragments in PDF files, oral histories, and academic footnotes. Their voices never returned. Not one letter, diary entry, or statement survives from either child. Every narrative we possess about them is mediated through officials, caregivers, critics, and archivists. Their own words were either never recorded or were erased alongside their bodies. But silence is not the absence of story. It is the evidence of something too dangerous to speak. This is the legacy of the Vesper County home, a pair of girls reduced to non-verbal subjects, a building redesigned to conceal rather than heal, a system that turned care into captivity. And 100 years of looking away. Even in the 21st century, public records requests to Indiana's Department of Health still return blank entries for the Winthorpe name. Even now, no apology has ever been issued. Even now, the lot where the North Wing once stood is occupied by a neighborhood park with no sign, no stone, no history. The institution is gone, but its silence lingers. Not because we don't know what happened, but because we do, and let it continue. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.